Astongo, everybody. Welcome to our second segment of History Speaks. Today's segment is History in the Making. Today I have Chief Chilcoat and Rodney Factor. Here today we're going to be speaking about the 20th century and today's current affairs that apply to the Seminole Nation. So just a quick recap. Yesterday we had talked about the removal, Seminole Wars, the Civil War, and the Treaty of 1856 and Treaty of 1866. And so today what we're going to go transition to is we're going to talk about the Dawes Commission in the 1890s. Rodney, could you elaborate on that?
All right. Like you said, most of these major events that took place concerning indigenous peoples of the Americas, as far as treaties, was to strip us of our lands. That was their main intent, and still is, to strip us of our lands and our sovereignty. But as they were looking, and I say they, the federal government and the settlers were looking at acquiring more land then and expanding the frontier, then they had to devise ways to do so and to strip us of our lands, because at that time there were more people that were watching as to what was taking place, and they wanted to try to do those things in a legal way, their laws, not our laws. And so that led up to dissolving our land bases in what is now Oklahoma. And they started in the western tribes first, in the western part of the state, and with the IRA and Indian Reorganization Act, and they talked about that, and then with us, Oklahoman Welfare Act. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, the Dawes that was their first step in leading up to those things, and that came about, like I said, because of them wanting to acquire more of our land and to strip us of our sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And so us as Seminoles, they came up with they approached our nations and discussed breaking up our lands in allotments, and of course our people were opposed to that, and so they came next with what they usually do, with threats.
Mm-hmm.
That they were going to dissolve these, our tribal governments. They were going to dissolve our courts. They were going to strip us of all of these things if we didn't, agree to the Dawes Act. And so that was the Curtis Act. And at that time, our forefathers, had enough foresight, to come up with an agreement, for the Seminoles. And that's what we did before that Curtis Act came into play.
Mm-hmm.
So by doing so, we retained our rights to courts and our rights to self-governance. And but that's kind of where it started. I have some information on that. I'd like to share it. This was written in February 8th, 2012, but this is 1887 Dawes Act. The U.S. theft of 90 million acres of Indian land. In his executive order declaring November 2011 Native American Heritage Month, U.S. President Barack Obama said that his administration recognizes the painful chapters in our shared history as a key part of that history.
Mm-hmm.
Today marks the 125th year since U.S. Congress passed the Dawes General Allotment Act in 1887. I'm referring to that date of February 8, 2012. Under that allotment legislation, for which there was no legitimate constitutional basis, Indian land holdings dropped from 138 million acres down to 48 million acres, for a loss to Indian nations some 90 million acres of land. During a period of the 47 years under the Act, some 60% of all Indian lands at that time are characterized as having passed to the United States, thereby resulted in tremendous boost to the economic growth of the U.S. economy. Designed as part of a divide and conquer policy, the Allotment Act divided the total acreage of Indian reservation lands into 40, 80, and 160 acre parcels. A head of family would receive 160 acres, A single person or orphan over 18 years would receive 80 acres, and persons under the age of 18 would receive 40 acres. Reservation lands left over with designated surplus lands and sold off to non-Indian settlers. Clearly, allotment was a massive grab of Indian lands by the United States, but a key goal of the policy was to destroy the integrity of Indian nations by assimilating Indian people into the body politics of the United States. It was an effort to make Indian people no longer understand themselves as nations, in an effort to cut their cultural connections to their traditional lands. During his first inaugural address, President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt stated his views that the Allotment Act was a mighty pervertising machine intended to break up the tribal mass. Roosevelt was the same president who stated that racist views that it is an incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of the red, black, and Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world race. Behind allotment was the desire to dominate and exploit Indian lands and resources. In 1886, 1 year prior to the Allotment Act, President Grover Cleveland delivered his annual address to both House Congress. He spoke of the management of Indian affairs and the accomplishments of an object which has become pressing in its importance, the more rapid transition from tribal organizations to U.S. citizenship of such portions of the Indians are capable of civilized life. Cleveland also expressed his view that Indians' inclinations long fostered by a defense system of control is to cling to the habits and customs of their ancestors and struggle with persistence against the change of life which their altered circumstances press upon them. But barbarism and civilization cannot live together. It is impossible that such incourageous conditions should coexist on the same soil. President Cleveland further said that the path in which the Indians should walk, must be clearly marked for them, and they must be led or guided until they are familiar with the way and competent to assure the duties and responsibilities of our U.S. citizenship. In his 1987 Law Review article, Constitution Courts Indian Tribes, law professor Milner S. Ball said the Allotment Act's purpose was to do away with tribes and assimilate their number into the states. Ball further stated that there was no constitutional basis for Allotment Act and its aftermath, not Indian desires of Indian land for minerals and for Christianization and Americanization of Indians prevailed, said Ball, eroding Indian nationhood by imposing U.S. citizenship on Indian people, despite Indian nations being completely outside the framework of the U.S. Constitution and working toward the disposition of Indian nations for the economic benefit of the United States were the main rationales behind the Allotment Act. Indian country is still dealing with the aftermath of the Dawes Allotment Act. Indian nations are making present-day efforts to reacquire portions of their traditional territories under the Wheeler-Howard Act of June 18, 1934, otherwise known as the Indian Reorganization Act. It created a legislative framework whereby American Indians could organize themselves as federally recognized Indian tribes and require additional lands. Although the IRA was supposed to remedy some of the desired results of the General Allotment Act, the U.S. government is now able to presume that such federally recognized tribes no longer possess the free and independent nationhood status of their ancestors. This is because Indian tribes organized under the IRA are legislatively presumed to exist according to the workings of the IRA under the jurisdiction of the United States. And so that's why the Allotment Act came into place, known as the Dawes Act. And like I said, our forefathers had this foresight to enter into a different type of agreement at that time. Still yet, our lands were divided up into allotments, and Since the Dawes, we have lost a lot of that land base, but still yet we still have some of it left. I presently live on my grandfather's allotment, and that land's been in my family for over 100 years, you know, and some were cheated out of their lands, you know, and that was the main purpose, you know, to strip us of our lands, and that struggle that we've always had, our ancestors' struggle is still our struggle today, you know, as far as being wary and cautious of legislative acts, you know, that, you know, would strip us of our sovereignty and strip us of our remaining lands. That was that led up to, you know, statehood.
So yeah, so we're going to transition to that. So that led up to statehood. So at that time, the jurisdictions were a little bit different, because when we're speaking about this, we're talking about Indian Territory, where it all becomes a state in the state of Oklahoma. So when we talk about statehood, how does that change our jurisdictions?
It really statehood really didn't change our jurisdictional boundaries. Really, the way that it lays out is that they went on ahead on an assumption that it did. It did not change our territorial jurisdictional boundaries, because they've been our territorial jurisdictional boundaries since the treaty, since it was established, for that to be our land. They just moved through it without any really true rights to do so, and this is our land. It's like going back to, I believe, to 1821 in regards to title of our land, trust of our land. This is our land. It doesn't, that we should not have to have trust for our land, but that was something else that was established early on as well, that affects our lands, as to like these allotments, and just like, well, in order for it to have no taxes paid to the state, it needs to be in trust. I personally, I disagree with that. Totally disagree with that. I don't think that there should be any framework for that to be established, because in statehood, they just, the land run, when they did the land run to do that, they shouldn't have been allowed to do that.
Yeah, because that was, they just gave it up for anybody to take. And
that's right.
And that took before the statehood. That was in 1889. And it was like, it was just under assumption that there was, I would kind of say it was kind of entitlement in a way. We were already here, and they just came and just wanted to stake the land, and
it was not their land to stake to begin with. And they want to talk about government to government framework. That was never the case. It wasn't. It was never handled like that, and it should have been, because the bottom line is that we are a nation, and we do have the framework as a nation to be able to represent ourselves in that fashion. And they did not allow that to take place. And now we have the opportunity to be able to engage one step at a time and move forward with a positive direction, trying to resolve that as best we can. And we'll work very diligently and very hard to be able to resolve that.
You know, also in 1889, before that land run could take place, then they had to make another agreement with the Seminoles, because that was part of our reservation, our former reservation, and there were certain articles that we agreed to under our treaty that relinquished those lands that freedmen and others, meaning other Indian tribes, could occupy that land. But that wasn't a clear title, you know. So, and they found that out, the federal government. So they had to come back to the Seminoles, and they acknowledged that we still had, you know, a say there, you know. Today, you know, also, you know, as a former reservation, then we still do have rights there, you know.
As a reservation, yeah.
But, you know, the thing is whenever they quit making treaties in 1871, then they started passing acts, you know, of law, federal law that, you know, for us, you know, and that came in after the Seminole allotment, you know, and I was saying a while ago that, you know, their interest was to relieve us of our land, you know, and once they found that, you know, a lot of our tribes and nations had natural resources, oil, gas, you know, coal, and some of the western tribes, you know, then they started devising ways to strip us of that, you know. And of course, in this area, it was oil, you know. So they started to pass these act after Seminole, or the allotments, you know. Then there was Oklahoman Enabling Act, Statehood. Laws make state partitions laws applicable and give state courts authority over heirship determinations. So they were deciding on who the heirs, you know, who was going to get the land. And like I said, that was another way for them to possibly lift the restrictions, you know, so in hopes that, you know, they could take those lands for taxes and stuff. And then in 1926, there's laws made state statutes of limitations applicable to allow state and federal taxation of minerals, because our restricted lands, and you know, there wasn't legally they couldn't take taxes, you know, or couldn't apply taxes, and so that allowed them to do that. And then it takes us to 1936, Oklahoman Welfare Act equalizes legal status of Oklahoma tribes with other tribes, and they're saying legally because, or makes us legal, or you know, the same because of the RRA, you know, I just stated a while ago, you know, then the federal government used that to try to strip us of our rights there, you know. And so for the 5 tribes that was left out of that on purpose of the RRA, then they created another federal statutes called the OIWA, Oklahoman Welfare Act, and a number of our 5 tribes agreed to that and organized under those statutes, that federal statutes. Again, our forefathers had the foresight to see, you know, what that was going to bring, and they saw the danger there, and they refused to do so. And looking out for the interests of the people and our sovereignty, they chose to organize it under our treaty. So we are a treaty people, and we always have been. I don't really like that phrase, but that's, you know, it is. You know, it's so.
So yesterday we had talked about sovereignty. One of the ultimate forms is the Treaty of 1856, and so now we're talking about the 20th century. Last year we had the 50th anniversary of it. The Seminole Nation, we have our own constitution. Could you just elaborate on the history of that and what that entails for the Seminole Nation? Because the Constitution, it took a while to get that whole thing written and put together. It took a whole committee of people.
It was years in the making. Didn't come about in a few months. It took years to transform from a traditional form of government to a constitutional form of government, and in that constitutional form of government, bringing forth as much as they could of our traditional government, you know, along with it, you know.
So in the span, so we say it took about 5 years for the whole Constitution to be put together,
right,
in place.
Right, and you know, I think that we always, with Seminole history and what's taken place, and you know, I've talked about that, you know, and emphasized on it that their main objective, you know, was to strip us of our sovereignty, you know, our lands, and our right to have a say in our own government, you know. And Seminoles have always stood steadfast on that, where, you know, they completely denied it, because our whole existence, you know, coming into Florida was our right to be free, our right to govern ourselves, you know, and our people throughout all of that time, you know, have maintained that. And, you know, that led up to our 69 Constitution. And, of course, you know, there was it passed over a pretty good margin, you know, and once that Constitution was in place, then the federal government are the ones that were urging tribes to do that, you know. Then our whole negotiations with the federal government, our relationship changed, you know.
So this is the big topic that everybody has probably been wanting to hear about for a while. Kind of just to clarify everything, this is part of the history in the making part that we're talking about now. Back in July, they had the Supreme Court decision, McGirt versus Oklahoma. This is something that's going to be talked about, documented for a while. It's going to be kind of how it's talked about, like Worcester versus Georgia. So, like I said, this is like history in the making. What does this, one, can you just get the history about this, this court ruling decision, and what it means for the future?
Personally, just in a nutshell, in regards to the Supreme Court's ruling in favor of Muskogee Creek Nation in regards to that their reservation has not been disestablished, is very profound. It impacts their reservational boundaries have always remained intact, and the only way that, based on the way that we understand it right now, is that it has to be clear and explicit language in order for that to be diminished or disestablished. And that was proven by the Supreme Court to never be the case, and so their reservational boundaries are intact today. Now, as we move forward ourselves as a Seminole Nation, that we are looking to have that as well on our side to be documented, that our reservational boundaries are intact. And that does change the framework on how all of this past history has been established. It brings it back to light. And it brings it back to now, to current time, not back in past. We understand what took place there, but it realigns us back into a position to be able to address those things that have always been a concern to folks that are traditional, that have understood that and understood the fight. As Mr. Factor has stated, our forefathers had the insight to be able to make those decisions to help us along this route. It is now in line for us to help them as well as they've helped us, as we help for future, for the people that come beyond us and after us. And this is where the roles that we play in regards to this are tremendous, not for ourselves, but for others that follow, because the impact that it has is tremendous for the nation and for the young ones that come up and understand the importance of this. The value of this is tremendous.
Rodney, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I want to step back a little bit, just leading up to that. I want to make reference to some of those laws that have been passed before McGirt came in, and one that affected the nations, and one was, citizenship in 1924. Citizenship was forced upon us without our consent. And then there was I'm going to skip some of those up to 1953, Public Law 280. 1968 saw, in the 60s, saw an increase in the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. One was the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. One in 1972, Indian Education Act. 1975, Indian Self-Determination Act. 1976, Indian Policy Review Commission. 1978, Indian Child Welfare Act. 1984, Indian Tax Status Act. 1985, there was a big case on the Pacific Salmon Treaty Act. In 1988 was Indian Self-Determination Act amendments. In 1988, Tribally Controlled Schools Act. In 1988, Federal Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Those things came into place, during that time period. And if you think about that, we wasn't given those rights. We didn't share those rights equally with others in the United States. We were always, treated, as second-class citizens. When we're the original. We come from the original owners of this land. That's why we're indigenous to this land, and that's why there were, many ways that they devised to strip us of everything that we had, and as we discussed yesterday, that there was a policy of extermination. They wanted our people murdered, I just put it like that, and that's what it was, extermination, and they wanted our people murdered to possess our lands. That's what, the whole thing was, and that's why our people fought. They fought for their very lives, and they were forced here, and they continued on, through perseverance, and that's why Seminoles are still here today, and some of us still maintain that knowledge of those things that took place, and it's not, and we want these things passed on to, younger people, that it needs to be taught in schools and not used as hate, but, just to, so that they will know history. They will know our history and our plight, throughout the years, to survive, and so, to me, that's leading up, and that all led up to that McGirt decision. Of course, there was a Murphy case before that that was based on jurisdiction, and it was ruled in Murphy's favor by the 10th Circuit, and it was appealed, by the state to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there was a tie vote. They ended it as, with a tie, and McGirt was making its way through the court system at that time, with the same thing, the jurisdiction, and in this case it was ruled, in McGirt's favor, that the reservation status was never diminished. And for us Seminoles, we have always maintained that, when we've talked about water rights, years ago, 20 years ago or so, but the Seminoles have always maintained that our reservation was never disestablished, and so that brings us today, that brings opportunity for the Seminole Nation, and also, from all of my understanding from tribal decision makers, is that, we're looking at, developing a good relationship, with the state and with the citizens of Seminole County, to working together, to me, there's not that much that's going to change of this, as far as people, and that fear tactic that's going on about people losing land and all of that, that's not going to happen. It's a federal government, again, using those scare tactics. The state government, in this case, with Stent going outside of the state and asking for legislation, creating a commission that doesn't have any natives on that commission. There was a thing that was passed here in 2007 called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where they agreed, to a consultation with the tribes. Anything that affects the tribes, then they would have to have our consent. The United States signed on, they came aboard on that, but here we are, in today's time, and still yet there's no consolation. There should always be consolation when it affects people, so that they would have input. But in this case, once again we're left out, and they want to try to push legislation down our throat. But to me, that Seminole spirit will prevail, and we'll resist that as much as we possibly can.
We will, to add to your statement, Mr. Factor, yes, we'll definitely be in support of sovereignty, and from my standpoint, my side, to fight that, to be able to press for those things that affect the continuity of our nation and how our nation operates moving forward. We need to be very mindful of those things that you shared, and understand the challenges that lie ahead in regards to this, because yes, there is forces out there that we are aware of, that are even that we understand to some level are fighting against us, and we have to be very cognizant of that activity, and be very sharp in how we address and handle those things, because it comes in many different shapes and sizes.
Yeah.
So Greg, we got a question from our Q&A. This one's for you, from Dana. It says, Chief Chilcoat, Seminoles were the first to publicly reject a surrender to the McGirt decision. What led to your decision stepping out and doing this first, even before the Creeks?
Oh, the importance of it. We did not have the foundation to really have an understanding of what was taking place. But once it was brought to my attention, and then once I realized what the storyline to the agreement in principle, what it represented, we were never brought into discussion about it. I was not. And then once I realized what it was about and the importance of it, that was the reason why we made the decision when we did, because it was necessary for us to do that. Because the agreement in principle with the statement and the language in that statement and the individuals that were bringing that statement forth was a major concern to me. No matter whom was on board with that agreement in principle. And that's the reason why, because the language in it was too, in my opinion, was too, it was, to me, it tore away from our sovereignty. And that was the reason why we jumped out to do that. I wasn't concerned about the others in regards to that, because it was irrelevant to me at that moment when we did that. It was just to protect our sovereignty as the Seminole Nation. That's the one parameter that we looked at.
Of course, it's protect sovereignty and to stand your ground. That's what Seminoles are all about.
Ultimately,
is fight for your rights. So we have another question from Kimura. It says, "Why wasn't the Constitution celebrated last year?" There was a celebration last year, wasn't there? Last March for the Constitution for the 50th anniversary.
Yes.
There was, yeah. So there was a celebration last year. I remember that. I remember being there. It was at the council house. So, so that was last year. It would have been nice to do it this year, but there's a whole deadly bias around terrorizing the planet.
And I will state this. I wouldn't want us to go any other direction at all. I mean, it was the ultimately they're challenging our sovereignty. And that's the key word, sovereignty. It's inherent. That's the key word of that to me. And Mr. Factor and I have talked about this. Now, it allows us to have the rights to govern ourselves, understand that too. But to me, the most powerful word to me, it's inherent. And that's huge. It's so impactful. The term sovereignty is so impactful and it's so huge on how we understand, how we move together as a nation, as a people, and how we function. And we need to ultimately, no matter from where we're at, no matter where we're standing, we need to ultimately respect that. Because we can say things, do things, that all at the end of the day, we represent the same thing. And that's the key cog that makes us all move forward and have that element, have that pride. Really, truly, have that pride for this and for our nation. And it's profound. And when you challenge that, I can get very disgruntled about that, saying that lightly, because it's just a true impact. People before us, we've not lived there. We don't know what they went through. We only understand it through history's sake, but we understand the struggles. And we cannot forego that. I don't care what time in space we're in. We can never truly forget that.
You know, I think that's I agree with that, and it's in the spirit of who we are as Seminoles. And that's the way it has to be. That we couldn't accept that. There's no way that we could accept that. I would like to share, though, since this is Native Heritage Month, for a lot of us, that's our everyday life. That we're Indigenous every day, every minute of the day, every second of the day. We live Indigenous, and we were brought up that way. And even though the attempts to assimilate, us, hasn't worked on a lot of us, and we realize that, is that our everyday activities, are based around our, who we are as a people. But this is back on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I just want to, read some of this, and because the assimilation part is that a lot of these things happen to our tribes and our nations, and And because a lot of people their minds are assimilated, it's like it's no big deal, you know, when they pass laws and everything, you know, that are suppressing us as a people, suppressing our rights, you know, as Native people, ignoring us, you know, like we have no say in anything, you know, that happens within our lands, our territories, our nations, you know. Then, you know, that's you know, denying us of our rights, you know, as human beings, you know, on this planet, you know. But this is the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, the General Assembly, guided by the purpose and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, in good faith in the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by states in accordance with the Charter. And when I say states, I'm referring to countries. In the international arena, they refer to states and countries, you know, as you're saying. Affirming the indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. And, you know, why do we have to come out with something like this? You know, we should always be treated, you know, the same, but we have to go through these measures, you know, to force governments, you know, to treat us as equals, you know. But affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and the richness of civilization and cultures, which constitutes the common heritage of humankind. Affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of people or individuals on the basis of natural origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Reaffirming that indigenous peoples in the exercise of their rights should be free from discrimination of any kind. Concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of their colonization, the disposition of their lands, territories, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particular their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. Recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their culture, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their right to their lands, territories, and resources. Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with states. Welcoming the fact that indigenous people are organizing themselves for political, economic, social, and cultural enhancement in order to bring an end to all forms of discrimination and oppression wherever they occur. Convinced that control of indigenous peoples over developments affecting them in their lands, territories, and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, cultures, and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. Recognizing that respect for indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practice contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. Emphasizing the contribution of the demilitarization of lands and territories of indigenous peoples to peace, economic, and social progress and development. Understanding and friendly relations among nations and peoples of the world, recognizing in particular the right of indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibilities for upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of the child. Considering the rights affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements between states and indigenous peoples are in some situations matters of international concern, interest, responsibility, and character. Considering also that treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements and relationships they represent are the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous people and states. Acknowledging that the Charter of the United Nations, the International Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as Vienna's Declaration on the Program of Action affirm and fundamental importance of rights to self-determination of all peoples by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, bearing in mind that nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any people their right to self-determination exercised in conformity with international law. Convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous people in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and indigenous people based on principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith, encouraging states to comply with and effectively implement all their obligations as they apply to indigenous people under international instruments, in particular those related to human rights in consultation and cooperation with the people concerned, emphasizing that the United Nations has an important and continuing role to play in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous people. Believing in this declaration is a further important step forward for the recognition, promotion, and protection of the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples, and in development of relevant activities of the United Nations system in this field, recognizing and affirming that indigenous individuals are entitled without discrimination to all human rights recognized in international law, and that indigenous people possess collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development of people, recognizing that the situation of indigenous people varies from region to region, from country to country, and that significance of national and regional particularities in various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration, solemnly proclaims that the following United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. There are 46 rights articles in Declaration on Rights and Indigenous People. The Seminole Nation, shortly after this was passed by the United Nations, passed a resolution adopting this as minimum standards for our nation. And as a nation, we need to start seeing ourselves as a nation, not a reservation, but a nation. And that these things that I read, these rights, since the Seminole Nation has adopted these things, then I would think that our government, our decision makers would hold true to these things and recognize the people's rights, that are spelled out here, and because maybe we haven't had those rights in the past, and through assimilation, a lot of people don't think that we have those rights, and we do. They have never been extinguished, We have that right, as human beings,
So we got some more questions coming in. This one is from Kevin. It says, how do you think the incoming presidential administration will help us along pursuing our ultimate sovereignty?
Well,
Go right ahead, Rodney.
I didn't hear the question.
Real quick, I'd like to say to Dana and Kamora, thank you for the questions that you presented. Do appreciate your input. Do appreciate your concern and how relative this is to the timeline for all of us and for yourselves. So we appreciate you being on board with this and seeing this and understanding the importance of it. So Mado.
So I'm gonna reread that question again. This one's from Kevin. It says, how do you think the incoming presidential administration will help us along pursuing our ultimate sovereignty?
I don't, any change like that, you don't know just right off the bat, how that's all going to take place. But I would like to think and hope that there will be change, and it will be on our behalf in a good way. But we have to be able to communicate with them to see where they stand on Indian rights and on indigenous peoples. We have to know what they truly believe and understand. But we have to have an opportunity to be able to communicate with them so that they understand our concerns as indigenous peoples for our nation. And they understand what we are looking for as far as working government to government. I feel inside that it will be a good change for us in regards to that. But what I want them what I want them to truly understand, when we say government to government, it is federal government to federal government. It's not from state to federal government, or federal government to state to federal government. I don't like the fact that that government to government communication is supposed to be from us to the federal government, and how, because we're equals in regards to that scenario, even though we know in past it's not been that way. But I feel that with this change, I feel very optimistic about that, and I look forward to the opportunity to be able to share our concerns with them.
Thank you for that. So we have another one from Chabon. It says, what can I, a regular Seminole, do to help the Seminole Nation be a great nation?
You want to answer that? It's up to you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kind of elaborate on that other one too. Biden has said that he would, recognize tribal sovereignty, and that's a big step, and also environmentally, that he was going to, revisit those things that President Trump has revised, from years of lobbying, to look out for our environment, that those things would be revisited, so there's good hope there. But I think as a Seminole member, then I think that I would read, as much as I could and acquaint myself with today's present government and try to understand, where it comes from and why certain things are in place, and study, what our bands, who our bands are, separate tribes that came from distinct locations, in Georgia and Alabama, and that we came together to form the Seminole Nation, and we worked together, as different tribes, throughout that time period to the present time, and sometimes we have glitches, I would say glitches, in decision-making areas, but I would hope that, we can come together, with this new decision from McGirt, and be able to stand together in unity, in behalf of our people, and I think that, those that are interested, and they acquaint themselves with who we are as Seminole people.
What up, Rodney? You have anything?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off Rodney's comments in regards to this, but the one thing that I want to share in regards to elaborate on is that in anything that we do, it doesn't matter whatever it is, there's always going to be struggles, there's always going to be differences, and there's always going to be hardships, no matter what that fundamental function is. But we have to understand one thing: our heart and our mind has to be together, no matter the struggles, because they sometimes can come at you at different shapes, different sizes, different aggravations. But our heart and our mind has to be engaged with what we're trying to do for the Seminole Nation, and we have to be mindful of that all the time. It's not easy. It's not. Nobody ever said it would be easy, and in all of this. But at the end of the day, our heart and our mind has to be in one side, one step, and it has to be for how we move this nation forward. And whatever that can be, because there's things that sometimes people want to say, I don't want to be associated, I don't want to do that, I don't want to be a part of that, I don't want to do that. I understand that, but that's it. But I think that the more people that want to get engaged and be a part of the Seminole Nation, that is a good thing. That's a good thing.
Absolutely.
And we need people that want to be engaged for the Seminole Nation, because we want to move forward. Here's another thing too. The way that I look at this, in his comments, we have to find balance on everything. All right, just as you stated earlier, we're in a new time, a new place. Now, there has to be balance in all of this. We have to move forward, but we also can never leave anything behind. The sovereignty part of it can never be left behind. It can never be forsaken, because that is the most profound element that we have. So we always have to be mindful when we move forward. We move forward with that in tow. That is with us. It's in our back pocket, and we live. That's the inherent right that we have, and we can never forget that.
Yeah.
So very good questions again.
But to me too, sovereignty. Without sovereignty, we cease to exist as a nation.
People.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Clifford. He asks, isn't Senator Inhofe
Writer.
Oh, writer. Isn't Inhofe writers moot since treaties are in the Constitution? I'll let y'all read that. It's kind of worded a little strange. It has something to do with Inhofe, I know that for sure.
Right. EPA.
This is a good question, Clifford. In regards to Inhofe's rider in 2005, in regards to what took place with this the Safety Act in the EPA, I don't know exactly that his rider is moot, because they did it in such a way to change the legislative laws. With a midnight rider with one paragraph, putting it in to slip it into the Safety Act. But I could go a little bit further with your question on this, and as to go and to say, just as Rodney spoke earlier, about us being a country, all right, a state, a country, in regards to the United Nations, how they apply that. So we could look at ourselves as a country, to a degree right there. All right. With that being said, then our representation that we have as those representatives representing us in our country, in the violation of that, breaking into our jurisdictional boundaries and our sovereignty, I think it could be looked at as being moot, but it is something that we're going to have to battle. Good question, Clifford.
So going off the previous question, what we just talked about, how we can help the Seminole Nation. One big one is participation. Mm-hmm. Being involved, come to your council meetings, your band meetings. Mm-hmm. Just read the history books. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of stuff. We had talked about yesterday. Rodney had mentioned, different journals by different captains and generals and the botanist, Bartram, and all these other people. So there's so many opportunities where you can, expand your mind on this, or just have the Seminoles by knowing the history of the people. Mm-hmm. Like I said, like getting involved. I've known you since I've been coming to council meetings, being a teenager. Mm-hmm. So it's you gotta kind of step out your comfort zone, just to make that transition. Don't be intimidated by just getting out there. Just do it. You'll feel a lot better when you get it done. Mm-hmm. Another option is what I've done is with textiles. Mm-hmm. Making Seminole clothing from the 19th century, early 19th century, the pre patchwork stuff, that kind of stuff. Because there's a whole history behind that, and that entails to the fur trade era and all that stuff. So there's many opportunities to help with the Seminole Nation.
To be a part, and real quick, I do want to say this, Jake. Yes, you have set a great example, being a young individual, still being a young individual, but of course being younger, and now you're a young adult. But the example that you've set, the leadership that you have implied to the others to follow, to understand that, is very tremendous. Mm-hmm. To just get involved, to be able to be a part, to want to have that activity, to engage, because things like this is the other side of that. This question, that's the other side of it. That's okay. Mm-hmm. But it starts from somebody wanting to be engaged, to inquire, and truly be genuine about it. Mm-hmm. And what I mean, be truly genuine, come from your heart and come from your mind, because this is an element of us as a nation, to be able to represent and work and do those things that are important for our nation to move us forward. And we want good things to come for the nation. Mm-hmm. And we need to have more involvement with our people, to be engaged, to get out there, understand the fundamentals of what it represents in their bands. The people within their bands, they represent their people, and the bands are very important, and we need to have more involvement. It's not meant to be a negative. Understand there's difficulties in anything that we do. We just need to have more involvement in that, understanding that, and work through that.
Also, I think that, for those that are interested, whatever age they may be, that politics isn't the only thing about the Seminole Nation, and like Jake said, our traditional clothing, the reason why they wore such clothing, we grew different foods, our people need to be reacquainted with that, those kind of foods that we grew, for us provided the most nutrition, and those kind of things, our arts and crafts, there's many areas, our ceremonial grounds, there's many different areas, as to be in Seminole, that they could start involving themselves in and start learning about the others as they go along.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
We got one more question. So we got our last comments. So we got our last 2 minutes of the show. Anybody just want to throw in some questions for us? I don't want to try to drag this on, but is there anything else y'all just want to?
I just think, to me, I think that right now with this McGirt case, it's the most important thing that's happened to Indian country, for many years, in my lifetime, for one thing, and I think that all of our people should acquaint themselves with the McGirt case. They don't have to read the whole case, but there's been enough written about it, and participate, into some of the Zoom activities that are taking place, discussions by attorneys that are taking place concerning the McGirt case, that we should all be aware of what it is and what it means to us as Indigenous peoples, and be able to share those things with our families, our friends, relatives, native and non-native, to assure them that there's no threat to them non-natives, that these are simply rights that we've always retained that have been denied to us by the state of Oklahoma, and that we are that was being acknowledged in their highest court, that we still retain these rights, but to me, our people, they need to start getting involved, in those areas. We need our young people to carry on, these things, they need to know the worldview of the East Seminole people, and how we looked at the world, not how they grew up looking at the world through the lens of those invaders, those that occupy our lands now.
See the world through Seminole eyes.
Right.
Well, I think that concludes our show. I just thank both of y'all for coming on, and thank you for your time.
Jake, I thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share in something that is so important to the nation and to our peoples. And I just think that it's I'm tremendously honored to be able to do it. I'm honored to be here with Rodney in regards to this discussion, because it is very, very, very important. And the outcome is challenging, but we're ready for it.
And another thing is that I just like to say to always be Indigenous. It's not just this month. It's not a Santa Day or nothing like that, or the Easter Bunny. This is us, and this is us forever, as Seminole people. So it's not just the month of November.
Easter Bunny.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll have more segments like this in the future coming up, so stay tuned. Mahalo, everybody.